The emergency room doors slammed shut with a decisive, heavy thud the instant a physician informed David Carter that his daughter would remain untreated until a hefty deposit was fully settled. A security guard brusquely directed him to vacate the treatment zone while nearby patients observed in hushed stillness, none identifying the weary father in his frayed coat. 3 stories above, the hospital's directors toasted their highest quarterly earnings ever on a lit rooftop terrace, oblivious that the man being ushered out could acquire the entire facility with one call. David Carter led an unremarkable existence. He piloted an old sedan, cycled through 3 identical jackets, and collected his daughter from school each day at 3:15, standing by the flagpole where other parents rarely glanced his way. A widower for 6 years since his wife succumbed to a prolonged illness, he had constructed his whole universe around a sole focus, raising Emma with maximum stability and ordinariness. Earlier, in another life, he had been a biotech engineer who devised a diagnostic tool that vastly improved early detection of a rare childhood disease. That platform was later purchased by a health investment fund for an amount that made him, virtually overnight, one of the wealthiest men on the West Coast. He accepted the payout, shifted most of it into a long-term holding within that same fund, then walked away from interviews, conferences, and all public acclaim. Journalists who tried to profile him found nothing, because David had quietly resolved years ago that money would never dictate his lifestyle or his daughter's upbringing. He still possessed one of the largest stakes in that fund, a fact known only to a tight circle of lawyers and financial officers, and he had never leveraged that position beyond signing quarterly paperwork at his kitchen table. To neighbors, he was the tired single dad working long hours at a downtown lab. To the fund's legal team, he was the sole name capable of swaying markets with a call he never made. His neighbors knew him as the man who mowed his lawn on Saturdays and waved politely without lingering. His daughter's teachers knew him as the parent who never missed a conference, arrived early, and asked insightful questions about reading levels rather than test scores. Emma herself had no clue her father's former business had ever been valuable, since he rarely discussed it and their modest home betrayed no hint of the fortune in his investment accounts. Occasionally, when fund documents needed his signature, he would sign them after Emma slept, treating it as a chore rather than an identity. He had deliberately built a life where his daughter's happiness outweighed any financial figure, and he planned to keep it that way as long as possible. Across the city stood Bennett Memorial, one of Seattle's most esteemed private hospitals, a glass and steel edifice featured in health magazines as a beacon of modern care. Its lobby boasted marble flooring and a grand piano that played softly mornings, while advertisements promised compassionate, world-class treatment to all who entered. Behind that polished facade, however, the board had spent years quietly restructuring priorities, tightening fiscal policies until profits outweighed nearly every clinical choice below. Richard Coleman, the chairman, had implemented cost-cutting that gutted financial aid programs, while Jessica Turner, the financial officer, enforced payment rules with inflexibility, leaving no room for exceptions regardless of medical urgency. Gabriel Brooks, the COO, managed daily enforcement, ensuring intake staff followed protocols without deviation. Charlotte Bennett, the CEO and granddaughter of the founder, believed she led an institution still true to its mission, largely because the board shielded the harshest numbers from review. It was into this precise setting, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, that David Carter's daughter suddenly spiked a perilous fever and struggled to breathe, forcing him to rush her through doors that would, within hours, deny her care. The drive to Bennett Memorial took 11 minutes, though David would later say it felt like an hour, with Emma slumped against the seat, her small frame trembling with chills. Upon reaching the emergency entrance, a nurse hurried forward with a wheelchair, and within minutes a young physician confirmed what David feared: Emma required immediate treatment for a rapidly worsening severe infection. For a brief window, everything moved as emergency care should, swift, focused, entirely on the child. Then the paperwork reached the financial intake desk, and everything shifted. A clerk informed David that Bennett Memorial required an $11,000 deposit before any further treatment, per a new finance office directive. David explained he could provide ID, employment history, and a formal promise of payment within days, asking calmly if treatment could proceed while paperwork was processed. The clerk apologized but reiterated that policy allowed no exceptions. When David requested to speak with someone who could override it, the clerk phoned a supervisor. Grace Miller, the emergency department head, arrived within minutes. Reviewing Emma's chart, her expression hardened. With 22 years of emergency medicine experience, she recognized that further delay posed real risk. She moved to authorize treatment herself, overriding the financial hold with her clinical judgment. Before she could finalize the order, her tablet buzzed with a call from Jessica Turner, alerted the moment a physician attempted to bypass a payment restriction. Jessica's voice, per two nurses who later recounted the exchange, was calm and businesslike as she reminded Grace that hospital policy forbade overriding treatment holds without financial clearance, irrespective of the physician's assessment. Grace argued that a child's condition was deteriorating in real time, but Jessica repeated the same line she had recited to a dozen doctors: no exceptions, no informal payment plans, no treatment without deposit confirmation. When Grace pushed further, Jessica ended the call and instructed the front desk to involve security if the father persisted. Within minutes, a guard approached David, asking him politely but firmly to step back from the treatment area while the situation was resolved through proper channels. What followed unfolded before a waiting room full of strangers, none yet aware who they were watching. David asked repeatedly whether treatment could begin while he arranged payment, offering to sign anything, leave collateral, call his bank directly from the lobby. The guard, following orders from above, told him he needed to move away from the doors. When David hesitated, two more staff appeared to reinforce the request. Grace Miller stood a few feet away, her hands clenched, watching a policy she despised play out exactly as designed, powerless to stop it through usual channels. An older patient nearby later told a nurse she had never seen a father look so controlled and so terrified simultaneously, whispering, never raising his voice even as he pleaded for his daughter's life. Eventually, David made the only decision he could. He called for an ambulance transfer to the nearest public hospital, where Emma was accepted immediately and placed on treatment without a single question about payment. As the ambulance doors closed on his daughter, David turned once toward Bennett Memorial's glass entrance, and for a moment, his expression shifted from grief to something colder and more deliberate. He followed the ambulance in his own car, staying only long enough to see Emma safely admitted and stabilized under attentive staff who began treatment within minutes of her arrival. Once assured she was in capable hands, he stepped outside to the parking lot, sat behind the wheel of his sedan, and allowed himself, for the first time in years, to think seriously about the power he had long tried to ignore. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through a contact list he rarely used, stopping on a name he had not called in nearly 18 months, Luke Sanders, the lead attorney for the investment fund that still held his controlling shares. When Luke answered, surprised to hear from him, David asked a single question in a voice quiet but steady: exactly how much of Bennett Memorial the fund currently owned. Luke explained that the fund had been accumulating shares in Bennett Memorial's parent company for most of a year, quietly approaching a controlling position as part of a long-planned acquisition strategy awaiting final approval. David asked how long it would take to execute that acquisition if he gave the order tonight. Luke, sensing something serious in his old friend's tone, answered that the paperwork had been ready for months, needing only a final signature to proceed immediately. David told him what had happened in the emergency room, describing it plainly, without embellishment, and by the time he finished, Luke's voice had lost its casual edge entirely. A long pause carried more weight than words before Luke asked whether David truly wanted to move forward with full control that same night. David looked through the windshield toward the hospital where his daughter now lay treated and safe, then said only that he wanted the paperwork sent within the hour. Within 20 minutes, secure documents arrived on his phone, transferring the fund's accumulated shares into an immediate binding acquisition of controlling interest in Bennett Memorial's parent holding company. David read every page carefully, his engineering mind cataloging each clause as methodically as he once analyzed clinical trial data, and when he reached the final signature line, he did not hesitate. With one digital signature sent from the front seat of his car in a hospital parking lot, David Carter became the majority owner of Bennett Memorial, along with every board decision, every financial policy, and every executive career inside its walls. Luke asked if he wanted to notify the board immediately, and David said no, that he wanted to see with his own eyes exactly how they behaved before they knew anything had changed. High above the parking lot where he sat, the rooftop terrace of Bennett Memorial glowed with string lights and quiet laughter, entirely unaware that the ground beneath their celebration had already shifted. That same rooftop event had been organized weeks earlier to mark the hospital's most profitable quarter in its history, and the board intended to enjoy every minute of it. Richard Coleman stood near the terrace edge with a glass in hand, telling a small circle of executives that disciplined financial policy had finally turned Bennett Memorial into a model other hospitals should study. Jessica Turner nodded along, adding that the reduction in charitable care spending alone had contributed nearly 40% of the quarter's profit increase, a number she recited with visible pride. Gabriel Brooks raised his glass to toast the intake staff, praising them for maintaining strict payment enforcement even under pressure, a comment that drew appreciative laughter from several people nearby who had clearly heard similar stories that week. Bonuses, it was quietly understood, would be substantial this year, and several executives were already discussing which luxury purchases they intended to make once the payouts arrived. Charlotte Bennett arrived late to the celebration, having spent the afternoon reviewing press coverage that troubled her deeply, several articles describing patients who claimed they had been turned away or delayed due to payment disputes. She approached Richard with her concerns, only to be told, in a tone that mixed reassurance with dismissal, that isolated incidents were an unavoidable cost of running a financially healthy institution. Charlotte accepted a glass of champagne she barely touched, standing at the edge of the celebration with a growing unease she could not yet name. Earlier that same week, Grace Miller had submitted a formal internal report documenting a pattern of treatment delays tied directly to the new financial policies, listing 7 separate cases where medically necessary care had been postponed pending payment verification. She had sent the report to the board's ethics committee, to Jessica Turner's office, and to Charlotte Bennett directly, hoping that someone with authority to act would finally take it seriously. The report sat unopened in Charlotte's inbox for 4 days, buried beneath routine administrative messages, while Richard Coleman's office responded with a brief note stating that the matters described fell within acceptable operational parameters. Grace pressed further, requesting a formal review, only to be told that current policy had been approved unanimously by the board and was not open for reconsideration outside the standard quarterly review cycle. Standing near the edge of the celebration that night, Grace watched executives toast their record profits, knowing that some of those profits had been built directly on top of delayed and denied care. She thought of David Carter's face as security guided him away from his daughter, an image she suspected would stay with her for a long time. Charlotte noticed Grace standing apart from the celebration and crossed the terrace to speak with her, asking quietly whether everything the reports described was truly accurate. Grace answered honestly, telling her that it was worse than the report suggested, and that if nothing changed soon, someone was eventually going to get seriously hurt or worse. Charlotte left the rooftop early that night, her earlier unease now sharpening into something closer to dread, though she still had no idea how quickly the dread would be confirmed. The following morning, an urgent notice appeared in every board member's inbox, calling for an emergency meeting at 9 o'clock, issued not by Richard's office, as was customary, but by the General Counsel's office of the fund that held the hospital's parent company. Richard read the message twice, assuming some administrative error, since no such meeting had appeared on any calendar the day before. Jessica arrived at the boardroom first, visibly irritated at having her morning disrupted, while Gabriel trailed in behind her, already complaining about the lack of proper notice. Charlotte arrived last, taking her seat quietly, sensing that whatever this meeting concerned, it was unlikely to be routine. At exactly 9:00, the door opened and Luke Sanders walked in carrying a slim leather folder, introducing himself as legal counsel representing the fund that had, as of the previous evening, acquired a controlling interest in Bennett Memorial's parent holding company. Richard let out a short dismissive laugh, telling Luke that shareholder changes happened periodically and rarely concerned daily operations, assuming this was simply another institutional investor rotating its portfolio. Luke did not smile back. He explained, calmly and precisely, that this was not a routine transaction, and that the new majority owner intended to attend the meeting personally to discuss the direction of the hospital going forward. Richard asked, with a trace of impatience creeping into his voice, who exactly this new owner might be, since he assumed he would recognize the name of any serious investor in the healthcare sector. Luke simply turned toward the door and said that the owner was already outside, waiting to be introduced. The door opened again, and the room fell into a silence so complete that even the ventilation system seemed suddenly loud. David Carter stepped inside wearing the same gray jacket he had worn the night before, walking to the head of the table with the unhurried calm of a man who had already decided exactly how this conversation would go. Jessica was the first to recognize him, her face draining of color as she realized this was the same man who had stood at her intake desk less than 20 hours earlier, begging for his daughter's life. Richard, still confused, asked who this man was and why he was standing in their boardroom. And Jessica, barely above a whisper, answered that he was the father from the emergency room, the one they had turned away for lacking a deposit. David did not raise his voice, and he did not need to. He placed a folder on the table thicker than the one Luke carried, and explained that everything inside it documented in precise detail exactly what had happened to his daughter the night before, along with 6 months of similar incidents pulled from the hospital's own internal systems. He described watching security guide him away from the treatment area while his daughter's condition worsened, describing it with the same steady, factual tone he might once have used to present a clinical trial result to investors. Grace Miller, who had been asked to attend without being told why, confirmed everything David said, adding details from her own report that the board had chosen to ignore for the past week. 2 other physicians contacted quietly that morning by Luke's office joined the meeting by video, each describing similar experiences of treatment delayed or denied due to financial policy despite urgent medical need. Charlotte sat frozen through most of it, the color slowly leaving her face as she understood for the first time in full exactly how far her hospital had drifted from the mission her grandfather had founded it upon. Richard attempted to interject, insisting that policy decisions were board-approved and therefore not his personal responsibility, while Jessica claimed she had merely been enforcing rules set by others above her. Gabriel said almost nothing, staring at the folder in front of him as though hoping it might simply disappear if he refused to acknowledge it. At one point, Richard turned to Charlotte expecting her to defend the board's decisions the way she had defended them in countless meetings before, but Charlotte said nothing in their favor. She admitted in front of everyone that she had seen fragments of these concerns before and had trusted her executives to handle them appropriately, a trust she now understood had been badly misplaced. Her admission seemed to unsettle Richard more than anything David had said, as though he had only just realized that even his closest allies in that room were no longer willing to shield him. Luke quietly noted for the record that every physician present had corroborated the same pattern independently without coordination, which left little room for the board to argue coincidence or exaggeration. The weight of that corroboration settled over the room heavily, and even Jessica, who had spent the morning insisting she bore no personal responsibility, finally lowered her eyes and stopped arguing. David let each of them speak, offering no interruption, allowing every excuse to be laid bare on the record before he responded. When he finally spoke again, his voice remained calm, though something in it had hardened considerably since the meeting began. He told the room plainly that as majority shareholder, he intended to call an immediate vote on the composition of the board effective that same morning, and that Luke would oversee the process according to the fund's governing bylaws. Richard's face reddened as he began to object, insisting that removing an entire board required due process, extended notice, and formal shareholder review under standard corporate procedure. Luke calmly explained that the controlling shareholder retained the legal authority to call an emergency vote under the exact provisions written into the fund's original acquisition agreement, provisions Richard himself had approved years earlier without reading closely. David added quietly that the same swiftness with which they denied his daughter care could now be matched by the swiftness of the decision about to be made regarding their futures. The vote, when it came, took less than 4 minutes to complete. Richard Coleman was removed as chairman first, his position terminated effective immediately, with security waiting outside the boardroom door to escort him from the building the moment the vote was finalized. He shouted that this was retaliation, that no court would uphold decisions made in anger, but Luke calmly reminded him that the vote had followed every legal procedure required, and that anger had nothing to do with the outcome. Jessica Turner was suspended pending a full financial and ethics review, her access to hospital systems revoked before she even left her chair, given the volume of policy decisions directly tied to her office. Gabriel Brooks faced an internal investigation into operational practices under his direction, particularly regarding how strictly intake staff had been instructed to enforce payment policy regardless of medical urgency. When it came time to address Charlotte, the room grew quiet again, everyone uncertain whether she would share the same fate as the executives around her. Charlotte spoke first, offering to resign immediately, saying she should have caught these patterns long before Grace's report ever reached her inbox, and that she bore responsibility for what her hospital had become under her leadership. David studied her for a long moment before responding, telling her that responsibility mattered, but so did the fact that she had never hidden a single report, never blocked a single physician, and had in fact been the first person on that terrace to ask hard questions the night before. He told her she would remain as chief executive officer on one condition, that she personally lead the effort to rebuild every policy her hospital had abandoned. Over the following weeks, David worked closely with Luke, Grace, and a newly formed ethics committee to rebuild Bennett Memorial from the ground up, starting with the single policy that had nearly cost his daughter her life. No patient, under any circumstance, could be refused emergency treatment while awaiting payment verification, a rule now written directly into the hospital's operating charter, rather than left to executive discretion. A dedicated assistance fund was created for patients unable to pay up front, financed in part by David's own resources, ensuring that financial hardship would never again stand between a patient and urgent care. Every financial decision affecting patient treatment would now require transparent documentation, reviewed regularly by an independent ethics board with the authority to override administrative policy whenever medical necessity demanded it. Security cameras were installed throughout the intake and waiting areas, not to monitor patients, but to ensure that no future employee could act the way security had acted toward David without full accountability. Physicians were granted explicit authority to begin treatment immediately in any case involving urgent risk, with financial processing moved entirely to a separate secondary track that never again delayed care itself. Grace Miller, whose ignored reports had documented the very failures David eventually uncovered, was promoted to chief medical officer, given real authority to enforce the standards she had fought for in silence for months. David also insisted that every new employee, from janitorial staff to senior physicians, complete a short orientation explaining exactly why these policies existed, so that no one could later claim ignorance the way Jessica once had. He requested quarterly reports summarizing every case in which the assistance fund had been used, not to track spending, but to understand which families still struggled to navigate a system that had failed them for years. Luke helped draft a new governance charter that permanently separated financial oversight from clinical decision-making, ensuring that no future chief financial officer could ever again issue an order overriding a physician's judgment. Charlotte proposed, and David approved, an anonymous reporting channel through which any staff member could flag concerns directly to the ethics board without fear of retaliation from management above them. Slowly, department by department, the hospital's internal culture began shifting from one of quiet fear toward one of open accountability, a change that took root gradually but held firm once it did. Charlotte Bennett changed as well, in ways that went beyond new policy documents and organizational charts. She began spending time in the emergency department itself, something she had rarely done in recent years, watching how patients were treated and speaking directly with the families who passed through those doors. She personally reviewed every complaint that had been filed against the hospital over the previous 2 years, reaching out individually to several families whose care had been delayed under the old policies, offering both apologies and concrete remedies. Slowly, the staff who had grown quietly disillusioned under the previous administration began to notice the shift, no longer bracing for conflict every time a patient arrived without full payment ready. Nurses who had once whispered about David's story in break rooms began speaking of him differently, less as a cautionary tale and more as the reason their hospital finally felt like the place they had originally trained to work in. As weeks passed, Charlotte found herself curious about the man who had walked into her boardroom and reshaped everything within a single conversation, wanting to understand not just what he had done, but who he actually was. What she eventually learned surprised her far more than she expected. David Carter had years earlier developed a diagnostic technology credited with saving thousands of children from a rare and often fatal illness, technology that hospitals across the country still relied upon in their pediatric wards. He had sold that company for an extraordinary sum, becoming almost overnight one of the wealthiest engineers in his field, a fact that had made brief headlines before he disappeared from public view entirely. Charlotte discovered that his withdrawal from public life had not come from any desire for secrecy or scandal avoidance, but from grief following the death of his wife shortly after the acquisition closed. He had chosen in the years since to raise his daughter with as much normalcy as he could manage, deliberately avoiding the attention his wealth could easily have attracted, preferring school pickups and quiet evenings over boardrooms and headlines. Charlotte realized that the man who had reshaped her hospital in a single morning was the same man who, until the night his daughter needed emergency care, had never once used his position to change anything at all. Her respect for him deepened not because of what he owned, but because of how deliberately he had chosen for years not to use it. When she finally thanked him personally for staying involved in the hospital's reform rather than simply walking away after firing the board, David told her simply that he had not done this for power, but because no parent should ever stand at those doors the way he once had. Months later, Bennett Memorial looked, in many ways, like an entirely different institution, though its walls and its name remained the same. Independent healthcare evaluators, reviewing the hospital's new policies and outcomes, ranked it among the highest in the region for medical ethics and patient care standards, a striking reversal from the quiet criticism it had drawn only a year before. Grace Miller often told new residents during orientation about the night a father was turned away from these very doors, using the story not as a warning, but as a reminder of exactly what the hospital now stood to protect. Charlotte Bennett, once uncertain and sheltered from the harder truths of her own institution, had grown into a leader who asked difficult questions before problems could ever grow large enough to make headlines. David Carter returned to his quiet life not long after the reforms were fully in place, once again picking his daughter up from school at exactly 3:15, wearing the same worn jacket, driving the same aging sedan. Emma, fully recovered, rarely thought about the night she had been rushed into an emergency room, though she would occasionally ask her father why nurses at that particular hospital always seemed to know his name. He would simply smile and tell her that people there remembered him for something he did once, a long time ago, on a night that mattered more than most. No one at Bennett Memorial ever forgot the lesson that emerged from that single ordinary Tuesday night, even long after the details of the story had faded into hallway legend among newer staff. A hospital at its core existed to save lives, not to weigh a child's suffering against a spreadsheet, and not to decide who deserved care based on what they could pay in that exact moment. It took one quiet, unassuming father, standing outside doors that had closed on his daughter, to remind an entire institution of the promise it had almost forgotten it made the day it first opened. And somewhere in that reminder was a simple truth that outlasted every policy change and every boardroom vote that followed it, that no one ever again should be turned away from the help they came there to find.